Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Gladstone Pasternak, the very proud Executive Director of the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for this very special exhibition and program, Lawyers Without Rights, Jewish Lawyers in Germany Under the Third Reich. And this is actually an encore visit to our museum after more than 15 years. So we're very proud to be able to show it again to you, a new audience. And I would like to just take a moment to acknowledge some of our board members who are here this evening, our board chair, Ira Giller, and Ira. And I would just like to acknowledge that you are sitting in the midst of a beautiful exhibition called Giller on Giller about Ira Giller's father, Norman Giller, and all of the beautiful architecture he created in South Florida and around the world, and Ira's continuation of that legacy. And then I'd also like to introduce Gerald Schwartz, another one of our board members. Thank you so much for being here. And I hope you all enjoy your evening here at the museum. Please pick up some information about all of our upcoming programming. We have a very busy Art Basel season coming up, so we look forward to welcoming you all back. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Bill Choik from the American Bar Association. He's the coordinator of this wonderful exhibition and program and works in strategic communications with the American Bar Association. And please welcome Bill to the podium.
Thank you, Susan, and I thank the museum and its staff for being a wonderful host. This is the second time since COVID that we've got the exhibit in a different location. Previously, it was in Orlando or near Orlando at the Holocaust Center there. And as a snowbird, I'm hoping we can keep it flowing in the South for the next few months. I want to acknowledge a couple folks. One old friend of mine, Judge Pete Evans, is sitting in the front. He brought, and his wife Debbie, he brought a number of folks all the way from Palm Beach County, almost enough to fill, I think, the jury box for a civil trial. And also a very special person he brought, Lisa Apple, who has a great story of her own, wrote a book, Wunschkind, Child Without a Country, captures her awakening after being born in Germany in 1941. And she was looking at a panel with me earlier tonight and said, recognized so many things. And one of the individual lawyers' profiles and said that my father was a good friend with the leader of that regional group. So welcome, Lisa. Do you all want to stand up and be acknowledged? The three of them right in front. I also want to welcome Judge Scott Bernstein and Judge David Young of, I think, I don't live here, but I think it's Miami-Dade County. And so thank you for coming. I'm not a lawyer, just a long ago journalist who can appreciate the rule of law and what can happen when the rule of law disappears. And this exhibit is a chilling reminder why all good people need to stand up and support rule of law. If you haven't got one of these, this little thing which is out there will give you a lot of information on the exhibit, its history, and kind of its background. And so I'm not going to go deeply into the history of it, but the German Federal Bar is really their exhibit that the ABA signed an agreement, memorandum of understanding for lawyers might understand that, about 10, 12 years ago. And we brought the exhibit to about 70 venues and also published the book, which you see out there and all around and which you can buy at the museum for about 50% off. So I urge you to take a look. That it's a translation of a German book into English with original forwards from Ben Ferenz, who I think at 102.5 is still the sole surviving Nuremberg prosecutor, and Justice Breyer. Yeah. Thank you. This exhibit vividly reminds us what happens when lawyers, the judicial system, and the just rule of law are undermined when abuses go unchecked and are permitted to flourish. As Axel Filges, who was very involved as president of the German Federal Bar and starting the exhibit many years ago, has said, non-Jewish lawyers in Germany basically remain silent. They failed miserably, and so did the lawyer organizations. We don't know why. That is why it's so important for lawyers and really everybody to speak up today, and that is why we are here. In looking at the panels in front of me, these two here, I'm reminded that good can come out of bad. On this one, William Dickman became a staff member of the American High Commission General Lucas Clay, and he settled into non-lawyer work in the United States, I think in the State Department and other places. To my right is Hannah Katz, who left Germany. She was one of the last consultants in Germany as lawyers were purged from the practice of 1938. She got her law degree in the United States, and proudly I can say she was a member of the American Bar Association. So in these panels, you have a record of how the Nazis undermined the rule of law by replacing it with the rule by law and the kinds of consequences that can follow. Tonight, we will tackle the question, can what happened then happen here? And let me introduce our friends who will help us to better understand that question. I'll keep the intro short because we only have an hour, and some of these people are probably well known to you all. Andre Siegel, second to my right, is a consul general in Miami for the Federal Republic of Germany. He's a career diplomat with a broad range of international experience, strategic and political and cultural affairs, and has a long connection to the United States and affinity with the United States. He was an AFS exchange student in Michigan during the bicentennial year, and that probably brings back some very fond memories, but cold memories. He's also posted in his diplomatic career in Boston, and has been a great supporter of this exhibit, participating in a similar program in Orlando and actually visiting when we had an opening reception there back in June. Steve Zach, next to Consul General Siegel, hired me 12 years ago at the ABA, so I cannot say anything but great things about him. Steve is a Cuban-American lawyer who fled from Castro's communist regime as a teenager. He received his JD from the University of Florida. He was the youngest and first Hispanic president of the Florida Bar, and later the first Hispanic president to head the ABA. Steve was also part, notably, of a legal team that won a Supreme Court case this past term, giving descendants of a Holocaust survivor rights to reclaim a painting by the French Impressionist master Camille Pissarro, taken from a relative by a Nazi regime. To his right is Brian Siegel, Consul General Siegel's brother in name. Brian served as the regional director of the American Jewish Committee and previously was an assistant director of intergroup affairs. He's got more degrees than probably most of us put together from looking at his bio. And finally, our moderator tonight is Hillary Bass, former president of the ABA and immediate past chair of the ABA Rule of Law Initiative. She earned her law degree locally at Miami and is president of Bass Institute for Diversity and Inclusion, and which she founded after a long and illustrious career in private practice. And a personal shout out to Hillary and a thank you. In 2017, as when she became ABA president, she created a thing called ABA Legal Fact Check, relatively short narratives intended for the public and the media to separate legal fact from fiction. I was given the task to execute Hillary's dream or concept. The idea has resonated with the public as well as the media and lawyers. And we've posted about 60 since then, including one today on the president's authority to classify and declassify information. And you could go to abalegalfactcheck.com to look at it. I am pleased to introduce Hillary to lead our discussion.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you for all of your hard work in bringing this exhibit here. So yeah, ABA Legal Fact Check was started when I became ABA president, really as a recognition that there are such a thing as facts. And we wanted to create a resource for lawyers, for journalists, and others who really wanted to look into some of the key issues of the day, whether it was relating to immigration or pardons or classifications of top secret documents, and to know that there was a source where they could actually get facts. And Bill has done a phenomenal job since its inception in tackling lots and lots of fascinating issues. But today we're here to talk about something very different. And I don't think you can open a newspaper anywhere in this country this month, last month, certainly next month, right before the midterm elections, without being hit with the question, will our democracy survive? And as someone who studied history and political science, that's a relatively new question, because I grew up in school just assuming that our Constitution, our court system, our system of checks and balances was always going to protect our democracy. And of course, we now find ourselves facing issues similar to, I suspect, those that were faced in Cuba in the 50s and in Germany in the 30s. And we thought it was well worthwhile to talk about some of those parallels and see what we could learn from it. Bill brought to my attention a billboard in Eastern North Carolina that he took a picture of. And it says, "Stop thinking, support autocracy." And obviously it's a joke. It's supposed to engender conversation. But it's really a recognition that there are forces before us that support the concept of an autocracy in this country. And tonight we're going to have conversations to try and determine what we should be doing, perhaps, those of us who care deeply about ensuring that does not occur. Obviously, we've all seen many recent examples of racist and anti-Semitic incidents. The ADL just reported that in 2021, there were 2,717 reported incidents of anti-Semitic assaults, harassment, or vandalism in the United States. And this was a 34% increase over what was noted in 2020. So it's not our imagination. This is really happening before our eyes. And of course, it leads to the question, can what happened in Germany happen here? We thought, now that Bill has introduced the panelists, that we would give each of them an opportunity to sort of give their perspective on this. And of course, we'll start with the Counsel General. After each of our panelists talks for a few minutes, we've got some questions for them, and then we'd like to open up to the panel to your questions. So, Mr. Counsel General, please, what are the lessons that you think we can learn from what occurred in Germany nearly 90 years ago?
Well, thank you very much for including me in this panel. And I think, yeah, I'll just give you a few the remarks concerning the historical perspective of what happened in the 1920s and 1930s in the shift from a republic towards an autocracy, or actually a totalitarian rule. Now, it's the period between 1918 and 1933 is commonly known as the Weimar Republic. Actually, it's a notion that was created by Hitler himself, and it was meant even to be a derogatory term, because the Weimar Republic was not no more a monarchy. That's the first thing to note, because the Kaiser, just before the end of World War I, had abdicated, of course, and the first German republic under a middle class and social democratic regime, a majority in parliament, was created, but under very difficult auspices. You had the first, let's say 5 years of the Weimar Republic were still very much the mark of the aftermath of the World War I, with the Versailles Treaty and the reparations payment, which were very difficult to accept for the German population and government at the time. And a number of political extremists on the right and on the left who were fighting in the streets and forming militia groups. And you had already in 1919, you had some political assassinations. The most famous ones are Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, the Communist Party, who were murdered in the streets. And that period was aggravated by economic difficulties because of the reparation payment on the one hand, but also rising unemployment and in particular a hyperinflation, which accumulated in 1923 to the extent that you paid 1 billion mark for a loaf of bread in Germany, which was of course untenable and needed a monetary reform. Now, once that happened, there was a period of stabilization and consolidation in the period between 1924 and 29, which in Germany we call the golden 20s. Here you say the roaring 20s sometimes, because it also saw a very amazing upspring of culture and arts, innovative art movements of all kinds, in sort of expressionism in particular. And you saw also a period of stabilization of Germany in the international context with a few international treaties and a rescheduling also of the debt. So you had a sort of a calm period between 1924 to 29, but one should note a little incident which happened in November 1923, the so-called beer hall putsch by a man called Adolf Hitler, who made an attempt of a coup in Munich and was arrested and incarcerated, but was released after only a few months of imprisonment, after having written his Mein Kampf, infamous propaganda strategy paper, which was the basis for his future actions. Now then, the real tipping points of democracy versus autocracy were just to come after 1929. 1929, Great Depression, that also had a big impact in Germany with unemployment that rose very quickly from 2 million to 4 and 5 million people, and was exacerbated by a deflationary policy by the then chancellor at the time. Still more closer, okay.
Walk into it
Okay.
better.
Oh, and early in 1930, there were elections where the Nazis became the second strongest party in parliament, and with a sort of an army still being revisionist and thinking that the Social Democrats had stabbed them in the back and were the reason for having lost the First World War, with a president who was also a former military, Hindenburg, and industry who was just trying to protect and cover up whatever they could protect. They thought they could cope with a minority government or with a government led by Hitler, but flanked by conservative and centrist forces. And that's why finally Hitler in January 1933 was nominated chancellor by the president. But of course, that was an illusion that Hitler could be sort of contained by these other parties. He very quickly seized the opportunity after, in particular, the fire of the Reichstag, the parliament, which was committed by, allegedly, at least by a Dutch anarchist. But the Nazis used that as an emergency rule pretext, arrested several thousand people, and prepared what was the seizure of power, the Enabling Act in March 1933, which actually established a totalitarian rule and abolished any parliamentary participation in decision-making. And that was, so that period between January 1930 and January 1933 and March 1933 was the real tipping point with actually the way of no return. Now, I won't dwell on what happened afterwards, the Third Reich. We can come back to that later on, but I'll just add a few remarks on what have we learned from that? What are our lessons learned? And in 1949, when the two German states were founded, the German Federal Republic, which was West Germany, had a very intense scrutiny of the constitutional flaws of the Weimar Republic and tried hard to avoid all those traps. One key issue was to restrict any type of emergency rule, which would allow the executive to just swipe away the parliamentary contribution to government. The next was to establish a threshold for extremist parties, which didn't exist in Weimar. So the Federal Republic established a 5% threshold for any party to be represented in parliament. And also, but the overwhelming fundamental change actually of the German constitution then was Article 1 of what was called the Basic Law, namely that human dignity is the overarching principle and that this is inviolable. And all government authorities must protect it. And basic human rights are binding all three branches of government as directly applicable law. That was a fundamental difference between Constitution of Weimar, which sort of in formal terms was a democratic constitution, but contained a number of very strong flaws, including also the one of presidential powers, which were in Germany, as you know, today we have protocol-wise, the president is still our number one, but the executive, the chancellor, is actually the key person in the executive government. And the Reichstag at the time of Weimar could remove the chancellor without any prerequisites. And in 1949, the fathers of the Basic Law of the new Federal Republic wisely put in a paragraph concerning the constructive vote of no confidence, which means if you destitute a chancellor, if you put him away, you cannot do that without replacing him with another one who has the majority in parliament, which is sort of the constructive element, which has led to, fortunately, a long period of political stability in Germany since. I'll make a stop here and come back to other topics maybe later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve?
Well, my story probably starts a little bit where yours ends. My grandfather was born in the Ukraine, and I visited Kiev and Baba Yar and realized that I could have been living there right now, except for the hand of fate. My grandfather was on the way to visit his family that had left Kiev and had settled in Detroit. And on the way, the United States passed laws that didn't allow any more Jews in the United States. So he took a sharp left and went to Cuba. Now, the way I tell the story is a little different. He couldn't speak Spanish and he couldn't speak English, so he thought he was in Detroit. And by the time he realized he was in Cuba, he already had a push cart and was in business. So we continued and lived in Cuba. And he was very successful in Cuba and helped, as a matter of fact, build Patronato, which is the synagogue in Havana, which you should all visit, which is still there. And matter of fact, Fidel has visited the Patronato on a number of occasions. He actually knew more about some of the Jewish traditions than some of the people who remembered. And there's pictures of him in the back of the synagogue. He also had some kind of affinity for the Jewish people. He allowed Jews to leave Cuba when nobody else, and go to Israel, when nobody else was allowed to do that. And of course, he was part of the unaligned nations, primarily in the Middle East, who did not like poor Jews in Cuba. I mean, in Israel, they didn't like them in Cuba either, but to go to Israel, and he continued to allow that. There was all kinds of stories about him having a Jewish member of his family, a Jewish mistress, but for whatever reason, he was very tolerant of the Jewish population. That doesn't mean he was tolerant of my family, because my family's businesses, my grandfather ended up in the shoe and leather business, and all those factories were taken over by Castro. He did promise everybody shoes. We knew he wasn't going to pay for it, so we knew very early on that we were going to have some issues. But for me personally, the day they took over the factories, and they don't call it confiscation, they call it intervenido, which means intervened, because under law, if it is intervened, it means someday you're going to get it back, so they don't have to pay you for it. So we all, right, so we all got in a car and went to the airport. And in the airport, some of you may see a movie called Lost City, wonderful movie, but they had a room almost this size, but totally surrounded by glass, and they called it the fishbowl. And as you walk in, you had to take off anything of value. They called you a cockroach, and you sat on a metal chair waiting to leave the country. Well, we thought so. But at that point, our names were called, and we were taken out of that room and into separate rooms incommunicado. And we were not allowed to talk to anybody. And frankly, I think it was during that night that I may have decided to become a lawyer, because as far as I knew, there was no one there to help me. There was no one who cared, and I didn't know whether I'd ever see my family again. It doesn't take many days. When I think about the immigrants today who are separated from their families, I think of that one night. And then we were taken to downtown near G2, which is their KGB, where the Swiss embassy took us over because the American embassy had already left, and we were under house arrest for 2 weeks, and ultimately came to Miami with the rest of the Cubans. So that's my own personal story in having experienced what it means to have no rights whatsoever. Now, one thing that probably summarizes everything we're talking about tonight is the Cuban Constitution. Pretty amazing statement, right? The Cuban Constitution. The Cuban Constitution is exactly the same as the American Constitution today when Castro came into power. I have a copy of the Cuban Constitution on my desk at all times. I have an English translation and I have the original Spanish. What does that tell you? It tells you that a constitution is only words. And unless we understand how to protect those words, they are ultimately meaningless. And that's where we are today in this country. I tried Bush versus Gore with my partner, David Boies. And I can tell you that we are on the razor's edge of a dictatorship, because what's happening right now, frankly, I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, it makes no difference to me. But I will tell you that in about 17 states, they are trying to change how a president is elected. They are trying to make the delegate named by the legislature, not by your vote. Not by your vote. And most of these legislatures, of course, all of them that are trying to do this are Republican. So you can go to vote and it's meaningless. If even one of these states are successful, because it only takes one state, because this country is approximately 50-50 divided. But with one of those states, your right to elect president will be history. Now, I remember my conversation with my grandfather right before we left. And I said, "How do you feel, Grandpa?" He said, "Well, I feel terrible, but I feel glad about one thing." I said, "How could you be glad about anything?" He said, "I've been a refugee twice in my life, but I'm going to the United States, so I know I will never be a refugee again." You know, I passed away a long time ago. I'm glad in some ways that he is not here to see what is happening in this country at this time. When I was president of the ABA, we set up a whole system about students studying the Constitution. Sandra Day O'Connor was very involved in that. She actually had a cartoon program for young kids called the Liberty Boys, but she spent much of her later years talking about the importance of understanding the rule of law. And the graduates of law school today don't understand it. The graduates of high school don't understand it. Recently, the Bill of Rights was taken around to just people on the street. And they were asked, "You know where this comes from?" 80% thought it was a communist doctrine. 80%. The graduates from high school, they know who Judge Judy is, but don't ask them who the Supreme Court judge is. Remember, as lawyers, we look at it a certain way. Our job is to get in the way of other people. We get in the way of people who don't like the Constitution. Remember, the rule of law is to protect the minority from the tyranny of the majority. Who doesn't like it? Majority. And this is not something in the distant past. When you see David here, when his dad became the first Jewish president of the Florida bar, it was fairly recently, last 50 years. And there was a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism directed towards him at that time. And so we have a situation that is minutes away from where we are today. And the problem we have today is so many people think that we are being protected by the Constitution and don't have any idea what their obligation is under the Constitution. My children can tell me what their rights are. They always do. But they can't tell me what their obligations are. And our obligation is to make sure that we protect the minority from the tyranny of the majority. In any event, we can talk about more of it later on.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Hillary. So we've learned some vital lessons as a Jewish people, unfortunately, from this dark time in history that we heard Consul General Siegel speak about. And first and foremost, among them, we know that we must stay vigilant to societal changes and to hateful ideologies. And experience has taught the Jewish people to constantly ask whether history is repeating itself. And of course, once again, we're seeing extremism has found fertile ground amid a global pandemic and rising economic uncertainty. And we've seen that the foundations of our democracy are under siege. In addition, in the past few months and years, Jews have been attacked on the streets, in our synagogues, including the 2018 Tree of Life synagogue attack that left 11 dead, the 2019 deadly attack in the synagogue in Poway, California, and many others. And as politicians from both political parties, as well as famous musicians and other public figures, make anti-Semitic statements regularly, and as anti-Semitism seeps into the mainstream through social media, we do have to legitimately ask the question then, is this just like 1939 Germany? The answer, in my humble opinion, is no. There are many reasons why today's challenges, though real, are not comparable to that dark era. One reason is the existence of the state of Israel. We must not take the one and only Jewish state for granted, and we must stand up against those who would demonize or delegitimize Israel. Another reason is demonstrated by tonight's event and the exhibit that we're opening. We are not standing idly by, as too many did during the lead up to the Holocaust, including here in this country. And many of us have been watching the Ken Burns series and understanding even more deeply what was happening in this country. So organizations like the ABA and leaders like Hillary Bass and Steve Zack, among others, are at the forefront of ensuring the rule of law. However, even if this period is not exactly equivalent to 1939, we know as a Jewish community that we must not have a failure of imagination of what might happen if we are complacent. Germany was a society at the height of culture and technology, and yet they descended to commit the worst atrocities of humanity. The reality we face and the challenges before us require constant vigilance and leadership, because we are truly at a crossroads in America today. Like many other countries around the world, we're experiencing increased mobilization on the far right and the far left, leading to increased populism. This populism has been exacerbated by extremists on both sides of the political divide who exploit the discontent of ordinary people and look to create scapegoats to blame for our society's problems. We must be concerned when we see populism rising, coupled with the weakening of our democratic institutions and the denigration of a pluralistic society, because we know when this happens, anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry and hate grow. As a result, just 77 years after World War II and the Holocaust, anti-Semitic rhetoric and violence have been rising again in Europe first, and now here in the United States at an alarming rate. In fact, in the US, the Jewish community has consistently been most likely of all religious groups to be victimized by hate crimes. Despite comprising just 2% of the US population, Jews were the target of 55% of all religiously motivated hate crimes in 2020, according to the FBI. My organization, American Jewish Committee, documented the rise in the US in 3 groundbreaking surveys on the state of anti-Semitism in America, first in 2019, then in 2020, and then in 2021. AJC's 2021 State of Anti-Semitism in America report revealed that 24% of American Jews reported having been personally targeted by anti-Semitism in the past 12 months. And 90% of Jewish respondents believe that anti-Semitism is a problem in the US. Let me finish by making 2 things very clear. First, anti-Semitism happens on both sides of the political divide and must be called out wherever it comes from. Whether it comes from our former president saying, like he did yesterday, that American Jews don't care about Israel, or on the other side, when Ilhan Omar says Jewish influence is all about the Benjamins, or when we see the UC Berkeley Law School student groups banning Zionists from ever speaking, we must call it out wherever we see it. Second, anti-Semitism is an issue for all Americans, not just Jews. In other words, anti-Semitism is really an assault on the core values of America, and anti-Semitism is a problem that will affect everyone if not addressed. The Jewish community has sometimes been called the canary in the coal mine because we sense the cancer of an unhealthy society growing before many others. Because at its core, Anti-Semitism is about envy, resentment, distrust, scapegoating, and conspiracy. These are the tools of those who would try to destroy democracy. So therefore, just a few weeks ago, AJC issued a society-wide call to action against anti-Semitism, which is a nonpartisan guide that provides strategies and tools across 9 sectors of society that are needed to mobilize our society to, 1, understand and identify when anti-Semitism occurs, number 2, how to respond to it, and number 3, how to prevent it. So while combating anti-Semitism is not new, this call to action on anti-Semitism takes a further step by laying out specific prescriptions for these 9 different sectors of our society. I encourage all of you to take a look on AJC's website, ajc.org, to find this call to action and find a way that each of you individually can play a role in pushing back.
Thank you, Brian. Mr. Consul General, I understand you're a diplomat and you have to show some restraint, but it would be very interesting, I think, to the audience to get your perspective about the fragility of the democracy in the US and what you're observing.
Well, thank you. Well, democracy is not a destiny. It's always fragile. Churchill has said it's the worst form of government except for all the others. It's always work in progress. From the outside, I think there are a number of issues which are astonishing and raising concern from a European point of view. One is, I think, a common feature in Germany. The United States is a federal country, so you have the states and the federal level. And as far as I'm concerned, I am of the opinion that today's situation requires a new reflection on old constitutional principles and so on, regulating the balance of powers between the federal and the state level. And I believe, for example, if you specifically calling about elections and talking about federal elections, currently it's the states who determine exactly what kind of electoral processes and details, how it is regulated. I believe, and many Europeans believe, that it is helpful to look how others organize this. And one of the things, I mean, common sense would require is to say, we need some kind of minimal standard to create a common procedure, a common trust in the electoral process, if we want to organize this in a credible and sort of long-term credible manner. Another aspect is the separation of powers. This is also a problem, was a problem in the Weimar Republic. As I said, the executive took more and more powers away from the other branches, the legislative and also the judicial branch. Now, if you look at one phenomenon here in Florida, which was very astonishing to me, the redistricting process, for example. You had a common bipartisan vote of the Florida legislature to adopt a certain map, with moderate changes of the electoral district, and you had the governor veto this map, and finally the parliament, the legislature, relinquishing its legal obligation, actually, and its constitutional role to do this, relinquishing this to the executive, and the executive finally was the one who has now, I mean, it's still litigation in court, but as a matter of fact, for these midterms elections, it's the map drawn up by the governor, which is valid for the current elections. So that, for me, is raising a lot of concern concerning the principle of balance of power and the separation of power, the different branches. Now, when a president who is a candidate to be re-elected and is not satisfied with the results when he calls an independent electoral officer, high-ranking, and requests him to add 12,000 votes to another, I think this man in Europe would be in jail right now. I don't know why this is not possible here. The in general, I believe that the prevailing, I think prevailing originalist interpretation of the Constitution needs really a review process, because many of today's problems cannot be solved with concepts of the 18th or 19th century. That's my observers believe. And one of the key issues which need to be changed or which need to be addressed here in the United States is a peace. How can you organize a peaceful transition of power? First thing is you need to clarify the electoral process. One thing that comes to mind is the Electoral Count Act of 1887, which has been the reason why there has been some attempts to do it differently, even at the last time. I think it's high time and must be done very quickly to reform the threshold of sort of alternative procedures to getting to the final election results ready. And another concerning issue is that we have right now a case before the Supreme Court, Moore versus Harper, which is a problematic issue concerning the so-called independent state legislature theory, which could, if in worst case scenarios, take away any competence of legislative and even the governor, take away, sorry, from the judicial branch and the executive branch, and would give unilateral power to the legislative branch to determine the outcome of elections, which to me is also a principle which is unacceptable. And finally, I mean, there are other things that one could talk about, like media competence, which I find really very much concerning, that no one believes anymore in professional journalism, but people look into social media when they're looking for their reality or alternative reality. If a former president has been sort of proven 20,000 times to have told alternative truths, this is also inconceivable in a European or German context. This person would be out forever. But finally, if 4 months before an election takes place, a candidate says publicly and repeatedly, the only way I cannot be elected is if there is massive fraud of my opponents. That is a profoundly undemocratic gesture and statement, which speaks for itself. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Your erudite analysis convinces us we really do have as much to be concerned about as we're all feeling. Steve and Brian, both of you focused on education. And obviously we know the old adage, those who don't learn from history are destined to repeat it. And yet we find ourselves, certainly in this state, and sadly we're not the only one, where there's significant restrictions being placed on our educational process and what can be taught in public schools. And of course, if you can't teach the history of slavery, for example, the history of anti-Semitism, the history of Native Americans, because it's going to make the students feel uncomfortable, I don't know what kind of an honest history we can teach. How do we bridge that gap and still be in a posture, as you've both advocated for, to learn from the past and to have it alter our actions in the future?
When No Child Left Behind was passed, all of a sudden civics went out the door. You had to teach math, reading, writing. I actually was lecturing in China. And when I would speak in law schools, I always gave the students an opportunity to ask questions. And they usually Google you. And I had just lost Bush versus Gore. And a young man stood up with 1,500 students with a little smirk on his face. And Mr. Zach, what did you learn by losing? Losing lasted about 10 minutes. Bush versus Gore. And after the chuckle, you think, is that a difficult question? For me, it was an easy question. I answered that in the United States, we learn when we have a problem, we turn to our lawyers and not our generals. And I wasn't sure I was leaving China at all after I said that, but it was very clear to me that that was something they didn't understand, that they expected some general to tell them what to do. We have to, there's a law, matter of fact, passed recently in Florida that now says you have to teach civic education. That's a starting point. But you must have an opportunity to have a real conversation with students about what history teaches us. And you know, it's like what Benjamin Franklin was asked when he left the Constitutional Hall. He was asked by a citizen walking by, you know, what kind of government did you give us? And his answer was, right, a democracy if you can keep it. There's nothing magic about the word democracy unless we do what is necessary to keep it. Now, as far as redistricting, you make a very good point. Everything starts with redistricting. And every time I talk about redistricting, people's eyes roll back in their head. I tried the DeGrande case in Tallahassee and up to the United States Supreme Court. It is the law of the land. And what happened is originally, and it was passed by Democrats, that said you had to create minority districts whenever possible. Well, what happened? Something called cracking, packing, and stacking, which you take minorities out of which were districts that could go either way, and you make them either strongly Republican, strongly Democrat, and then you may have a minority district. When I did the trial, the Florida Senate was 20-20, 20 Democrats, 20 Republicans. Now it's like 15-5 because they were required to legally do a readjustment. So there is law behind what's being done, but it's law that's being abused and misused. And there was, in the Constitutional Revision Commission, which I was privileged to sit on, there was a motion to have a revision commission. It failed by one vote. If we really elect the right people, and other states do have a redistricting commission, which has taken the politics in large measure out of redistricting. We could do that here if we elected the right people. If
I think, you know, we have to start from the premise that American exceptionalism is something that we've been brought up to understand, that the democracy, that the experiment that is the United States is unique. And part of it is the fact that we have, you know, certain rights and obligations. And I think what happens is when we look at what's happening in the world and we look at the fact that a recent Freedom House report found that the world is experiencing its 15th consecutive year of democratic decline, where more countries have moved away from democracy than toward it. When we see and watch with horror as the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, launches a sweeping invasion of Ukraine, you know, basically attempting to crush the sovereignty of a sovereign nation and attempting to destroy the post-World War II liberal order, students need to understand what we're up against here and what we're facing and what the choices are so that we understand. Now, in terms of teaching history, I think Germany provides actually a really excellent example in the way that Holocaust education is mandatory. It is in many states, not all states in the US, but it demonstrates, and if you speak to Germans who understand the curriculum, it speaks to the fact that there's an understanding that we have to face our own histories and we have to face the painful parts that we're even ashamed of if we're ever going to move forward. In our country, I think we have a hard time with that, accepting the fact that we have to do the same thing. Book banning, of course, is dangerous and unacceptable. I always think that there's a saying that we use at AJC when we're forming coalitions with other groups where we say, if you want to have a friend, you have to be a friend. So it's this concept of, in a way, of reciprocity, right? If you want African Americans to care about combating anti-Semitism, but you do nothing to show that you care about racism, or name whichever group that's being impacted, so it's something even deeper. It's something missing in our society. It's empathy. It's something where we need to think about what other people are going through and what their origin stories are if we expect them to understand or care about our own. Now, the how in which this education takes place, in my mind, is equally important to the education itself. In other words, you have these floating terms that have been propagandized and instrumentalized, critical race theory and intersectionality. Yeah, these woke, the term, these terms that are basically used by different parts of the political spectrum to castigate or to frame things in a certain way. The point is that we have to find a way that we can address the shameful parts of our history and teach it so we don't repeat it and so that we can move forward as a country. But it has to be done in a way that doesn't, I will tell you, the Jewish community oftentimes gets caught very much in the middle of this, because, we are, if it's binary and it's oppressor versus oppressed, then many times, not all Jews are white, but many Ashkenazi Jews in the United States are. And so Jews see themselves as being part of being allies to other communities. But when we're painted as the oppressor, it's not a comfortable position for us. And so we have to find a way that we can teach these topics and these subjects without, being so simplistic and saying that there's an oppressor and an oppressed, that it's much more complicated than that. And we have to be able to have these painful and difficult conversations. That only happens when you build trust with other communities, when they see that you care about them and that you are going to help them. So that's a big piece of the work that I think we all need to.
Brian, how many Americans, if you took a poll today, do you think a majority of Americans feel that way? Or the majority of Americans saying, yeah, that there's no problem with discrimination? And I don't think they resent somebody who says they don't have a right to discriminate. Yeah, look at Kanye West's recent statement. How many voices have you heard criticizing that? Oh, he's a free thinker. Well, he's a racist, is what he is. And you don't hear people calling him out. And as a poet once said, it's better than I could ever say, you start by burning homes, and you end by burning people. And that's what we're burning just about anything we don't want.
We only have a few minutes left. I did promise to give you all an opportunity to ask any questions of the panel. So if you do have any, please raise your hand and we'll get you a mic. Okay. What do we do now is the
Yeah.
question.
This case coming up to the Supreme Court, which could, in a wink of an eye, change the way we select president. Right? That's a done deal. It's up there, isn't it? Do I understand it?
Highly politicized. Well, you start by electing a good president. Yeah, I say you start by electing a good president. I mean, I read an article just yesterday there's a new book called The Divider. Have people read that? By Glasser. Talks all about what's going to happen in Trump's second term. If you really want to get scared, read the book. And that's a possibility. Anybody who says it isn't a possibility is not looking at the figures. So what we got to do is make sure that we continue to elect the right people. But the problem is, and I really believe that we're in the minority today. Everybody in this room is in the minority, not the right minority, the wrong minority. Minority who wants to do something about it, and the majority just happy as can be that it's the way things are. And I have my own personal philosophy, by the way, which I'll share. People say, how could people that I know, that you know, that are really smart, good people vote for somebody like, I'll call that man, okay? And I believe that for many people, he stands between the past, where it was controlled by white Anglo men, and the future. And in 54 it is, 2054, we will be a majority minority nation, period. And that scares the hell out of people today who don't want that to happen. And he stands between that and keeping things the way they are. People disagree, but
Well, I'll chime in, because I have to wear my hat as working for a 501c3, and so we don't support or promote candidates for political office. But I will say, I think these issues run much deeper at a societal level, and I think it's really, we need inspiration. We need inspirational leadership, that's for sure. But we also need to accept some responsibility, some personal responsibility to do something to, find friends in other communities that are suffering and, help out. We're coming out of a pandemic. Hopefully we're coming out of it. We're in a time, we might go into a recession. There might be people losing their jobs. We know, and the Jewish community knows, that when these things happen, you heard from the Consul General, when these societal pressures start hitting a population, people want answers, and they want easy answers, and when people are willing to give them those easy answers, we know where that leads. So instead of sort of being complacent and saying, or being sort of feeling like we can't do anything about it, no, you can. You can go out, get involved. You can go out and, have these conversations, make sure people are paying attention. But I don't think it's the time to throw our hands up and say, it's lost. It's actually the opposite. It's the time to figure out, whether it's through the ABA or AJC or a panoply of other excellent organizations, there are really good people who are at the forefront of fighting back against autocracy and authoritarianism. And so I don't want everyone to walk out of here sort of feeling like this is a fait accompli. It's really, I think it's in our hands.
Well, on that note, please join me in thanking the panelists for their fascinating and erudite discussion.
Well, let me join in thanking all of you so much for being with us this evening, and Bill for coordinating the program. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the members of my own staff, our curator, Jacqueline Goldstein, and our museum manager, Nancy Cohen, for all that they did this evening. I'd like to thank all of you who joined us in person and all of you who joined us virtually. Thank you so much. And a special thank you to Consul General Siegel for this special refreshments that I now invite you to join us. And so please partake while you look at the exhibit. And the book is available in the gift shop. And thank you all so much. What an incredible evening here at the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. Thank you for joining us.